This week on Wookie Drives, I dive into the Infiniti brand for the first time on this channel and look at Infiniti's G line, their take on the compact luxury/executive car. This is a 2012 Infiniti G25. Nissan's Infiniti division has sort of had a rough go over its lifetime. Not as impressive as Toyota's Lexus cars, and not as sporty as Honda's Acura ones. Infiniti has sort of struggled as Nissan as a whole has gone through its own downward spiral. It's hard to keep up with BMW and Lexus when your parent company is busy trying to cut corners and stretch product cycles well past their competitiveness. Which is a shame. Infinitis typically aren't bad cars. But as time has gone on and competition has not only stepped it up, but has also grown larger as a whole with brands like Genesis being launched as well as the several startup EV brands, Infiniti has sort of felt like it's been forgotten. Like the quiet kid in the back who gets straight B- and C+. They do their schoolwork and don't cause any drama, but they don't rise above in any way to make themselves stand out from the crowd. So, 15 years later, when their former classmates see a rare big life update on Facebook, they all go, "Oh! That kid! I was wondering whatever happened to them." And the Infiniti G line is one of those cars. Lacking the driving dynamics of the BMW 3 Series, lacking the quality, materials, and prestige of the Mercedes-Benz C-Class, and lacking the build quality and reliability of the Lexus IS. Heck, even Cadillac's CTS, which was the odd duck at the time as it sat above these cars in size, but also sat below their mid-sized brethren in size, was also memorable for slapping supercharged LSs in their Performance V models. The Infiniti G line lacked most, if not all of that. The one thing that it did have, though, was the claim to fame that it was derived from the famous Skyline nameplate that us Americans never got to experience before. Much like Toyota and Honda, Nissan had a need to sell its upmarket JDM models in America. But the Nissan name itself lacked the prestige that would drive luxury car buyers to their dealers. So almost concurrently, Nissan would develop the Infiniti brand as a landing spot for these models. Rather than develop a world-beating flagship like Lexus would do with the LS. Instead, Infiniti would take a page from Acura's handbook and bring upmarket JDM Nissan models to the United States for the first time. Infiniti's first model, the Q45, would be a re-engineered Nissan President, which was Nissan's Japanese flagship at the time. Shortly after, a mid-sized personal luxury coupe, the M30, was introduced, itself a re-engineered Nissan Leopard. But Infiniti also needed an entry-level product, and that would be its G line. Much like Acura's Integra, the original G line would be based on a small front-wheel drive Japanese market car, this one being the Nissan Primera. But despite two generations, including a second generation that used a multi-link rear beam suspension inspired by those on the 300ZX and Nissan Skyline, the original G line never really took off like Infiniti had hoped. Not nearly like Acura's Integra, which already had a large tuner car following by the end of the 90s. So when it came time for the third generation of the G, Nissan and Infiniti flipped the script. The new car would instead utilize rear-wheel drive architecture, use 6-cylinder engines, and be available in a 2-door coupe for the first time. All the ingredients to make the car take on the segment leader, the BMW 3 Series. And those ingredients came courtesy of another JDM Nissan, the famous Skyline. Concurrently, the Skyline would go through a massive generational update where the famous nameplate would get a complete clean slate design that saw it move to Nissan's new FM platform, sharing with the new Infiniti G line in the reborn Nissan Z. And people were excited. Here it was, the Skyline us Americans could finally buy. And the hype was real. I discovered the Skyline hype with my R32 Skyline GTST video a couple of videos back. And the new G line even benefited from sharing its platform with the 350Z with tuning options being available. People responded in droves, and the new G line outsold the outgoing model almost 4-1. While the first two Gs would only hover around 10,000 sales per year, the V35G, as it was known internally, would debut midway through 2002 with 40,535 Gs sold, and gradually rise in the next two model years to peak at 71,877 sold in 2004. Infiniti finally had a compact offering the buy-in public wanted, and soon development began with the fourth generation, chassis code V36. An evolution of the previous generation, the V36G saw an expansion of models and options, and would see sales peak in 2009 with over 87,000 Gs sold as a result. Joining the coupe and the sedan would be a convertible in 2009. In 2010, would introduce a performance model in the IPL, and finally, an entry-level model with the G25. While the V35G would have a single engine available, the V36 would see a few. Initially, the only available engine would be an updated version of Nissan's VQ V6, being the VQ35HR. But that engine would be replaced in 2009 with the VQ37 VHR V6, producing a respectable 328 horsepower and 269 foot-pounds of torque. The IPL model would bump that power to 348 horsepower and 276 foot-pounds of torque. The G25, however, would intend to be the G's low-cost base offering, intended to take on the Lexus's IS250 and BMW's 328i. This model would take the 2.5-liter VQ25HR V6 from the JDM Skyline 250 GT and plop it into the G for the first time. The G25 would also cut all sorts of options, from the 6-speed manual, navigation, and technology and premium packages available in higher Gs. But the G25 was available with Infiniti's Attessa all-wheel drive, and those models would sneak a little X in the model name, being G25X. But compared to the larger V6 models, the G25 was seen as slow, and Motor Trend reported the 0 to 60 as 7.5 seconds, a full 2 seconds slower than the G37 models. And in the age of luxury cars increasingly being measured in 0 to 60 times, the G25 sold poorly and was quietly dropped from the G's lineup after 3 short model years following 2012. But soon things would get weird, as the G would be technically dropped when Johan de Nysschen would come to lead the brand in 2012. And he would do what he became famous for and completely rebrand Infiniti's alphanumerics, much to the confusion of buyers everywhere. You see, since its inception, Infiniti has incorporated alphanumerics similar to that of many luxury brands. A letter representing a model line, and a number representing the engine displacement in liters. So with this car, it's the G25. G for the model line, 25 for the 2.5-liter V6 under the hood. Infiniti's midsize model at the time was the M line, and before that there was the famous flagship Q line. The SUVs would get a similar convention, adding the letter X behind their initial model letters to represent that they were either a crossover or SUV. Well, Mr. Johan saw the nostalgia for the old Q45, Infiniti's first and probably most important model. So he got Infiniti to revamp everything to represent the old Q. So the G line became the Q40, the M line the Q70, the SUVs being the QX50, QX60, QX70, and QX80. Especially with the exploding SUV line, things soon became confusion. Before you had a clear model line and numbers representing what was under the hood. Now you had a mush of Qs and multiples of 10, not really representing anything other than the bigger number means bigger car. And don't worry, Mr. Johan would leave Infiniti in 2014 for Cadillac, where he'd have that brand go through a similar alphanumeric rebrand that confused buyers much the same. And honestly, with everything else Infiniti's gone through, all that rebrand really hurt Infiniti in terms of sales and just overall outlook. Every car sounded like it was the same thing as the last, and yeah, you can't sell luxury cars like that. Anyways, that rant out of the way, how does the 2012 Infiniti G25 feel? Well, it feels fine. Inside it feels very period Nissan, which unfortunately means it doesn't live up to the period Mercedes or BMW in fit and finish. Those models simply use better materials on the inside, and unfortunately the G25 just feels like a period Nissan with more options and goodies, and maybe just a little bit nicer materials. But despite that, it still feels like a nice experience on the inside. I mean, it's still miles ahead of what Cadillac was doing at the time, so that's something. You'll get a big screen that higher models would include navigation with, but here it forms a very early infotainment system. And a backup camera that's nice and lovely in low resolution. There's a clock on the center stack to remind you that you're in a luxury car. Also, the floor mats don't just have the Infiniti logo in them, they even included the G25 model name, which is a detail I wasn't really expecting to see on the inside of this car. And the bonus over other Nissans are that the detents in the glove box and center console and sunglasses holder do feel stiffer and just more solid over period Nissans, so that's something. In the back, it's not that bad. The center armrest folds down and it's pretty massive. Like, why is it this long? And the cup holders in them are neat little fold-out mechanical bits. Folding it down also reveals the ski pass-through through the trunk, which is pretty important for a car like this. The one thing lacking back here is some sort of charging port. Even an old 12-volt port would have been good to have back here. But I, at 6'3" tall, do fit back here, just with my head rubbing just a hair. Alrighty, so it's no BMW on the inside. How does it feel on the road? Unfortunately, that's where I was let down the most. Suspension feels fine. It does its job to provide a smooth ride for a small car on rough country and city roads. Heck, the 2.5-liter V6, even being the base underpowered option, doesn't feel offensive at all. Sure, it's not revvy like larger VQs, but it does a fine job of propelling the car forward in a smooth manner, which is something you look for in a luxury car. No, my one biggest issue with this car is the steering. The steering is where the V36 Infiniti G is where I was let down the most. For a car aimed directly at the 3 Series, unfortunately the steering just doesn't feel good. Once you're on the road, there's a heft to it that makes it feel more direct, but as a result, it feels artificial. Around parking lots, there's a vagueness that immediately just had me go, The steering just feels artificial, and for a car that's based on the Nissan Skyline, that's an indictment on the direction the Skyline had gone in 20 years. Driving this car almost back to back with an R32 Skyline feels like Nissan has lost its way. Gone were the days of Nissan developing possibly the best driving car in the world. Here it feels like Nissan was phoning it in last second to make sure they have a 3 Series fighter. This was the moment for me where it became clear that Nissan's downward spiral was at its full effect. The era of La Cost killer Carlos Ghosn was in full effect here, and unfortunately the G-Line just doesn't live up to the competition, especially when you compare it to the Germans that this car was aimed directly at. I wanted to like this car more, but as soon as I turned that wheel, I felt let down. The Nissan that produced the R32 Skyline was long gone, and the Nissan I grew up loving as a kid was too. I love Nissan trucks from this era. I owned a 2006 Nissan Pathfinder and would love to own another one someday. But unfortunately, the V36G fails to live up to its ultra-competitive class of cars. I want Nissan to succeed. I want Infiniti to succeed. But cars like this are why both brands have had a slow slide in quality and brand image throughout the 2010s. Thank God they couldn't put a Jacko CVT in this, as that quite possibly would have made me hate this car. And that's my qualm with the 2012 Infiniti G25. It's not a bad car. Despite a previous owner tearing up the driver's side door with years of resting their arm on the armrest and tearing up the trim as a result, it still feels like a solid put-together car. But when you stack it up against its competition, when you stack it up against what its JDM counterpart was 20 years earlier, it just falls short. And unfortunately, when it comes to selling a car, just being good enough may not be enough. Especially in the cutthroat compact luxury segment. It's just on a grand scale of the compact luxury segment, a B- just doesn't compete against A's and A+. And that's unfortunately where the 4th generation Infiniti G line falls short. 2012 Infiniti G25, the quiet kid you forgot about in your algebra class. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you once again for watching another episode of Wookie Drives. Huge shout out to Mark of Kannapolis, North Carolina for letting me drive his recently purchased Infiniti for this show. If you have a car or truck you like to see on the show and happen to be in the Mooresville or Charlotte, North Carolina area, email me with a submission of your car at wookiedrives@gmail.com. That's wookiedrives@gmail.com. Submit your car to wookiedrives@gmail.com. Don't forget to give the video a like, drop a comment with some feedback. Any sort of interaction with this video really helps small channels like mine grow in the algorithm. Share with all your Nissan and Infiniti friends. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell for more Wookie Drives like these. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.
I really should have followed the GPS.
I'll just ask this guy. Excuse me, sir! Do you know where casinos?
The Infiniti G sedan, because luxury should inspire confidence,
It's not from around here.
no matter what road you take. Infiniti, inspired performance.